Citizenship clause of 14th Amendment to the US Constitution say that if a child is born in US, that child automatically becomes a US citizen. In 2025 January, President Donald Trump signed an executive order saying that these birthrights should not apply to the children whose parents were neither US citizen nor lawful permanent residents. And that executive order was challenged before the US Supreme Court. And ultimately, by a 6-3 majority, the court struck it down. What is fascinating about the judgment is that instead of immediately deciding whether the Trump's executive order was valid or not, the court traveled back almost 400 years into the history. The judges said that if we really want to understand what the 14th Amendment means, we first have to understand where the idea of this birthright citizenship actually came from. And that story does not begin in America, it begins in England. And in those days, the US did not even exist. America was still under British rule, and English common law was applicable there. People were not called citizens, they were called subjects of the king. Now there was a very interesting relationship between the king and the subjects. It was a reciprocal relationship. The king had a duty to protect his subjects, and in return, the subjects owed allegiance to the king. So think of like this: protection on one side, allegiance on the other side. And that was the foundation of English common law. The Supreme Court said that this is where the entire story of birthright citizenship begins. Protection, allegiance. To explain this principle, the court relied on famous English decision called Calvin's case of 1608. At that time, England and Scotland were two different kingdoms. Then Queen Elizabeth I of England died without leaving any children. After her death, James VI of Scotland became James I of England. So although England and Scotland remained separate kingdoms, they were now ruled by the same king. Now comes Robert Calvin. He was born in Scotland after James became the king of both kingdoms. Later, Calvin inherited some property in England. Some English people objected. They argued, Calvin was born in Scotland. He is a foreigner. How can he own land in England? So that question before the court was very simple. Was Calvin a foreigner, or was he a natural born subject of the king? The court answered that question in a very interesting way. It said, don't look at the nationality of his parents. Don't ask where his ancestors came from. Instead, ask one simple question. Was he born under the protection of the king? If the answer is yes, then he owes allegiance to the king. And if he owes allegiance to the king from his birth, he becomes a natural born subject. That became the principle laid down in Calvin's case. In simple words, protection creates allegiance, and allegiance creates citizenship, or in those days, subjectship. The famous English jurist Sir William Blackstone also explained exactly the same principle. He said that every person born within the king's dominions received the king's protection. And because they received that protection, they owed allegiance to the king from the very moment they were born. So notice something very important. The rule was never about the nationality of the parents. The rule was about where the child was born. However, there are certain exceptions. Suppose the king had lost control over a territory because enemy forces had occupied it. Since the king could no longer protect the people there, the child born in that territory would not owe allegiance to the king. No protection, no allegiance. Similarly, children born to foreign ambassadors were also treated differently. Even though ambassadors lived in England, the law treated them as remaining under the authority of their own country. Therefore, their children were not considered natural born English subjects. This entire principle came to be known as Jus Soli or Jus Soli, simply meaning the right of the soil. In other words, your place of birth gives you your legal status. Now here is the interesting part. According to the majority judgment in Trump case, when America became independent, this principle never disappeared. The British crown might have disappeared, but the legal principle remained there. The only thing that changed was the terminology. Earlier people were called subjects, now they became citizens. Earlier they owed allegiance to the British king, now they owed allegiance to the United States. The Trump administration tried to defend the executive order by pointing to another historical example. It argued that Native American tribes live within the geographical boundaries of the US, yet they were not treated as US citizens at that time. So the question was, if birth within US automatically creates citizenship, why were members of those tribes excluded? Supreme Court answered that by looking at the issue of sovereignty. According to the majority, the tribes were not excluded because of their race. They were excluded because they were treated as separate sovereign communities. Even though they live within the geographical limits of US, they governed themselves, had their own political authority, and were not fully subject to the authority of the US in the same way as ordinary citizens or ordinary residents. So the court said that this was a very narrow historical exception. The exception existed because another sovereign authority was recognized, not because the people belonged to a particular race. And that distinction was important because the government was trying to compare tribal members with the children born to immigrants or temporary visitors. The majority rejected that comparison. It said that children born to immigrants are fully subject to US law. They can be governed by the American courts, prosecuted under American law, and protected by American law. Therefore, unlike the historical tribal exception, they are subject to the jurisdiction of the US and fall within the protection of the 14th Amendment. Now, another important case was discussed by the court, that was Lynch versus Clark of 1844. This case raised almost the same question that we are discussing today. The issue was, if a child is born in US to foreign parents, does that child becomes a US citizen? The facts were simple. A girl named Julia Lynch was born in New York and her parents were citizens of Ireland. They had come to US only temporarily and intended to return to Ireland. In other words, they were not permanent residents of US. The argument made against her was straightforward. Since both her parents were foreigners and were only temporarily staying in US, she should not be treated as an American citizen. Court rejected that argument. It was held that there is no distinction between a child born to American citizens and a child born to foreign parents. What matters is where the child was born, not the nationality of the parents. The court went a step further. It said that even if the parents are only temporary visitors or temporary residents, a child born in US is still a US citizen by birth. According to the majority in the present judgment, Lynch versus Clark became one of the strongest American authorities recognizing the principle of birthright long before the 14th Amendment was adopted. The majority therefore say that when the 14th Amendment was enacted, it was not creating any new principle. It was simply giving constitutional protection to a rule that the American courts had already recognized. Now we come to what the majority calls one of the darkest chapters in American constitutional history. That is Dred Scott versus Sanford of 1857. As the conflict between the northern and southern states over slavery intensified, many southern states slowly began moving away from the traditional common law principle of birthright citizenship. A new argument started emerging. They said that even if slavery was abolished and even if a black person became legally free, he still could not become a citizen because of his race or his blood. Dred Scott was an African American slave. He filed a lawsuit claiming that he had become a free man because he had lived in places where slavery was prohibited. The court, however, rejected his claim. The Supreme Court of US then held that African Americans whose ancestors had been brought to America as slaves could never become citizens of the United States, even if they are legally free. According to the court, black people were not regarded as part of people of US within the meaning of the Constitution. The court went even further. It held that since Dred Scott was not a citizen, he had no right even to file a case in a federal court. In effect, Dred Scott abandoned the traditional common law principle for African Americans. Instead of looking at where a person was born, the court looked at his race and ancestry. In simple words, the principle of soil was replaced by the principle of blood. The majority judgment in the present case reproduces portions of Dred Scott to demonstrate how deeply racial discrimination had entered American constitutional law. The majority in the present case describes this as a constitutional tragedy. The judgment notes that the decision was widely condemned across America. Abraham Lincoln famously criticized it as an astonisher in legal history. The majority says it was ultimately the 14th Amendment that overturned the injustice created by Dred Scott and restored the principle of birthright citizenship. After this Dred Scott judgment, America realized that something had gone terribly wrong. The country wanted to make sure that no court would ever again deny citizenship based on race. So in 1866, Congress passed the Civil Rights Act of 1866. The act declared that all persons born in the US and not subject to any foreign power, excluding Indians not taxed, are citizens of the US. This was the Congress' first attempt to overturn the effect of Dred Scott. But immediately another question arose. Is an ordinary act of Congress enough? What if a future Congress simply repeals this law? What if another court interprets citizenship differently once again? So Congress wanted a solution that no future parliament and no future court would easily change. So they decided to place this principle directly into the Constitution itself. That decision gave birth to one of the famous provisions in the American constitutional law, that is the present Citizenship Clause of 14th Amendment. The amendment begins with these historical words: all persons born or naturalized in US and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the US. Now, according to the majority judgment in the Trump case, every single word in this sentence was carefully chosen. The first requirement was simple: a person must be born in US. But the second requirement has generated constitutional debate for more than 150 years. The person must also be a subject to the jurisdiction of the US. So what does subject to the jurisdiction actually mean? The majority say that the word jurisdiction simply means the power of a government to govern people and enforce its laws. The court explained that every sovereign nation has complete authority over everyone present within its territory. If a tourist visits America and commits a crime, American courts can prosecute him. If a businessman violates American law, American courts can punish him. If a temporary visitor breaks the law, he is answerable to American authorities. In other words, temporary visitors are fully subject to the American jurisdiction while they are physically present in the country. This, according to the majority, is exactly what the 14th Amendment means by the phrase subject to the jurisdiction thereof. Now comes the most important precedent in this entire case: United States versus Wong of 1898. This is the judgment where the court relied upon while deciding the Trump case. So what were the facts there? Wong was born in California. His parents were Chinese citizens. They were lawfully living and domiciled in US as residents. But because of the Chinese exclusion laws in the country, they were not eligible to become American citizens. They were not diplomats, they were not government officials, they were simply Chinese nationals living in America. In 1894, he traveled to China to visit his family. When he returned to US, the immigration authorities refused to allow him to back into the country. Their argument was simple. They said, your parents are Chinese citizens. You are also Chinese. You are not an American citizen. You can't be allowed here. That dispute ultimately reached the US Supreme Court. The legal question before the court was, does a child born in US automatically becomes an American citizen if he is a child of a foreigner? The court held that 14th Amendment had adopted the all common law principle of Jus Soli or Jus Soli, the right of the soil. It said that birth within the territory of US combined with being subject to the US, being subject to its jurisdiction, was enough to acquire citizenship at birth. Accordingly, the court held that he was an American citizen by birth. So why this case was so important in Trump judgment? Because the majority say that Wong settled the meaning of 14th Amendment more than 125 years ago. According to the majority, if a child born to Chinese parents who were not American citizens was entitled to citizenship under the 14th Amendment, then the same constitutional principle also applies today. So after examining nearly 400 years of legal history, What did the Supreme Court finally decide? Interestingly, the government did not dispute most of the historical background. It accepted that 14th Amendment was rooted in common law tradition. It accepted the idea of a reciprocal relationship between the sovereign and the people, where the sovereign provides protection and the people owe allegiance. The real disagreement was over the meaning of the word allegiance. The government argued that a child born to temporary visitors or persons who were unlawfully present in US could not or could never owe the kind of complete or full political allegiance required for American citizenship. According to the government, something more than mere birth on American soil was necessary. But the Supreme Court was not convinced with this argument. The court said that the government could not point to any convincing historical evidence showing that the original understanding of the 14th Amendment required the parents to be permanent residents, lawfully present or domiciled in US. Instead, the historical record consistently showed one principle. If a child is born within the territory of the country and under the protection and authority of that sovereign, the child naturally owes allegiance to that sovereign from the moment of his birth. The court then turned to the actual wording of the 14th Amendment. It observed that the citizenship clause mentioned only two constitutional requirements. First, the child must be born in US. Second, the child must be subject to the jurisdiction of the United States, and that's all. Nothing else. The Constitution says nothing about the nationality of the parents. It says nothing about whether the parents are American citizens or not. It says nothing about whether they are permanent residents. It says nothing about whether they entered the country legally or illegally. So majority says the executive order issued by President Trump introduced new conditions that simply do not appear in the Constitution. In particular, it made the immigration status and residence of the parents relevant for deciding the child's citizenship. The court held that President cannot rewrite citizenship clause through an executive order. If the Constitution guarantees citizenship on the basis of birth and jurisdiction, the executive cannot impose additional qualification. So by a 6-3 majority, the court struck down executive order and reaffirmed the traditional principles of birthright under the 14th Amendment. So in simple words, the majority concluded that the Constitution and not the President decide who is an American citizen. That is how the court put an end to the controversy.